Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paula Fabiani.
Hello, that announcement made me feel famous. Anyway, I'm Paula Fabiani, CEO of the Institute for the Development of Social Investment and of the Brazilian Philanthropy Forum. I have the honor to introduce you to two individuals who have taken a stand. In times when the space for civil society and freedom of speech is shrinking, and in many countries, governance is under threat, the work of Peter Eigen and Herzog are more than relevant. Herzog founded the Institute Vladimir Herzog, an organization that advocates and promotes freedom of speech, strengthening human rights and democracy in Brazil. Ivo's father, Vlado, or Vladimir Herzog, was a journalist who was assassinated by the dictatorship of my country in 1975. Ivo took a stand and created the largest data and news platform about the dictatorship period, besides developing innovative projects with young students, fostering civic engagement and promoting engaged journalism. And sharing the stage with Ivo, who's going to start this session, is Peter Eigen, who I admire immensely. Peter left the World Bank and created one of the most important organizations in the world that combats corruption by promoting accountability, governance, and transparency. I would like to invite Peter Eigen to the stage, the founder of Transparency International.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and also thank you very much for your friendly welcome. I'm very excited to be here because this is an important meeting, and I must admit I have been here several times, and each time I'm very inspired, I'm energized, I learn a lot, and in fact I wanted to talk about my experiences in running Transparency International, in running the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative and a number of similar initiatives. But I noticed that the previous panel has done this already so well that I simply can pick up where they left. I mean, it is true that as civil society organizations we were able to make an impact, to help the world to recover democracy, in particular help a globalized economy to reinstall something which one would call the primacy of politics over the market. In other words, the capacity of society to shape what they want to happen in their economy. And that primacy has been lost. In fact, I would talk about failing governance as far as the global economy is concerned, and therefore what I would like to do right now at this final event of this wonderful conference, I would like to appeal to you as very powerful supporters of civil society organizations, and I'm mainly talking about advocacy civil society organizations rather than the very important service and charitable civil society sector. So this support which you have been able to provide to advocacy civil society organizations is, in my opinion, a tremendous value that you can contribute and have contributed to creating a better world. And this is why I would like to simply summarize again what I experienced in terms of the most important elements of a better world, of better governance, of what we in Germany call a soziale Marktwirtschaft, a market economy which is determined by society rather than society having to adapt to the market. And there it is, to me, quite clear that the present focus of the world on national governments as the main actors of global governance, the reliance of national governments is overstated, is not adequate anymore, and has basically led to the failing governments I mentioned in the beginning. Yes, the national governments are in many ways the legitimate power which can contribute to a better world, but they cannot do it alone anymore, and that is quite clear. There are at least three asymmetries between the capacity of national governments and the market and the world to be shaped, to be supervised, to be governed. One is very obvious, is the geographic asymmetry. It is a bit like a referee on a football field who is only in charge of one particular penalty area, while in the other areas on the football field, other rules and other referees are in charge. This is a geographic limitation which is asymmetric with the tremendous freedom of multilateral organization, multinational companies which can operate freely across borders, across regions, and in that sense it's a tremendous limitation for national governments to take responsibility. The second important asymmetry is one of the time horizon of the decision makers in national governments. In particular, in democracy, they have a relatively short time horizon. They think for 3 years, 5 years, for basically of the tenure which they have in order to apply then again for maintaining power. While the problems and the issues of global governance are of long term. I mean, if you talk about climate change, about environmental destruction, about overfishing, about human rights violations, about poverty, these are issues which have a long time horizon, which the decision makers have to have in the back of their mind as the incentives, as the sanctions if they fail for developing their motivation. And the third asymmetry is, of course, the diversity of constituencies. And it's quite clear that people in Myanmar have different expectations from their national government than the people of Estonia or of Nigeria and so on. So it is in this context that it's quite natural that nation governments cannot handle global governance anymore. And global governance is very important. It is not only how the world is governed, it goes all the way to the communities. Global governance affects everybody at every level. And so we need a new paradigm of government, a new paradigm of governance. And part of that paradigm is the civil society, is advocacy civil society. And what we have seen here today of Global Witness and of Transparency International, as it was described by John Githongo and so on, it shows that civil society can play an active, constructive part. And this has been growing. It has started basically in the United States. It has become very strong in London with its civil society hotbed, basically. It is now also moving into the rest of the world. And therefore we can be very proud, and you can be proud of the support. And here in the room are quite a number of philanthropic organizations who have helped me as Transparency International to get going and to keep going. But we have to recognize there are two major backlashes which are happening right now, two major problems. One has to do with the shrinking space of civil society activists. And this is quite clear, and in fact my successor, Ivo Herzog, who is going to join me here, is a very good example of what happens to people who speak up to the authorities. I mean, his father has been murdered. The shrinking space is very serious, not only in Russia, not only in Ethiopia, not only when Global Witness, Patrick Alley, reported about this, when they are losing people who are being harassed, who are being imprisoned, who are being killed. It's even moving into organizations like the German government. Last week we had an attempt of the German Minister of Transport to have the tax privileges withdrawn from our environmental NGO in Germany because they criticized him. He says, why should we give tax privileges to an NGO which then turns around and criticizes the government? So even in a relatively civilized nowadays German society, this kind of argument comes up. So, and the second problem is that the fundraising necessity of civil society organizations is a tremendous risk in terms of losing one's credibility, losing one's independence, losing one's strength. And therefore, what I thought I put forward to you as powerful supporters, basically as powerful, like the air in which we breathe for organized civil society, is whether we cannot try to organize a global system, a global light touch organization, not quite like the United Nations, but a bit like a United Citizens organization, which will try to take care of these two issues. One is to provide a modicum of financing to advocacy civil society, partly by, say, a Tobin tax, but partly by, say, a 1% contribution by philanthropic activities, partly by asking the development agencies like the World Bank and so on to make contributions in order to overcome this very first step of civil society organizations to form themselves and to have a basis from which to operate. And of course, we would have to make it quite clear that only eligible civil society organizations would be able to participate. The speaker said earlier that civil society is not accountable. This is simply not true. Civil society is extremely accountable, but some of them are not accountable. I mean, I remind you of the existence of the Global Accountability Charter of Civil Society, which has been issued by the International Civil Society Institute, and where many civil society organizations have to pledge to adhere to them. And of course, they have to account to their donors, to account to their constituencies. But then also try to have this organization, which should be run by a sort of a multi-stakeholder board, a small board, to protect activists and journalists, by the way, against the risks of this shrinking space into which we are facing right now, in order to keep civil society organizations alive and make them powerful in order to join basically national governments, not replace them, join them, and join the private sector to together develop on a basis of a multi-stakeholder philosophy, a governance worldwide for a better world. So this is my short presentation to you and my short recommendation, and it would be fantastic if a powerful group like you would make the beginning to ask for a study of a possibility of creating this United Citizens organization in order to make sure that the role of civil society organizations can be protected for a better world. Thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce my friend, my new friend, Ivo Herzog, who will talk to you about a very similar problem.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all. Really quickly, my name is Ivo Herzog. I'm son of Vladimir Herzog, who was tortured and murdered in Brazil in 1975. He was a journalist. He was Jew. His family fled Yugoslavia during the Second World War through Italy and came to Brazil. So he had seen the worst of humanity in his childhood. And when they came to Brazil, Brazil was the land of freedom, peace, etc. So they thought they would be safe and they would never suffer any sort of violence. In 1975, he was the head of journalism of the public television in São Paulo. The government was trying, the dictatorship was trying to be harder because they had lost elections for the Congress the year before. So they were arresting lots of people, torturing them, trying to find the underground network of people that were working towards democracy. And through that process, they came and they tried to arrest my father on the 24th, but they convinced that they shouldn't arrest my father because he had to put the news on the air. So my father was never arrested. He presented himself voluntarily on the following day, and less than 6 hours later, he was dead. The government tried to sell the version that he had committed suicide. He was Jew. By the Jewish tradition, if you commit suicide, it's the biggest crime that you can commit, so you have to be buried close to the walls of the cemetery. And Herzog Sobel, the rabbi at that time, when they saw the conditions of the body of my father, said this person didn't take his life. He was murdered, and gave the order to bury him in the center of the cemetery. His death was a milestone in the history of Brazil because of the circumstance, because who he was. Several universities went on strike, several unions went on a strike, and then on the 31st of October, the 7th day of his death, there was a ecumenic act in the main cathedral of São Paulo, Catholic Church, Jewish, and Protestants. The police closed the whole city so people couldn't get there, even though there was more than 8,000 people that came inside us and go back to their homes in silence. So it was a peaceful movement, and history tells us that that day is the beginning of the decline of the dictatorship. In parallel, and I want to make to give my thanks, or even more to make in the honor of women, because women has a passion of fighting for the loved ones. My mother dedicated her whole life in the search for justice and the truth. So immediately, although we were in a dictatorship, she opened a process against the government through our legal system. And we won on 78. That process was just to make the government accountable for what happened to my father. Over 43 years later, we still look for justice. Last year, Brazil, for the first time in its history, it was found guilty for committing crimes against humanity because of the case of my father. Because Brazil doesn't investigate all the deaths during the dictatorship, saying that they can't investigate because of the amnesty that we had in 79. Brazil is the only country that gave forgiveness to the agents of the government. So one of the issues that we have about violence in Brazil and this craziness on politics with Bolsonaro and etc., is that we never made we never reconnected to our past. We never did justice about our past. That has to do with the Afro-descendants, with the Indians. Hundreds of thousands of Indians have been killed through the history of Brazil and through dictatorship as well. So for over 30 years, the history of my father was about his death. And in 2008, I decided to put together the information about my father, talk to friends, and we did a strategic plan for almost a year. And in 2009, we opened the Vladimir Herzog Institute on the date of his birth as a way of celebrating his life. And our mission is to work towards, as Paula said, towards freedom of speech, democracy, and human rights. I mean, all of this is one thing, really, if you look like in detail. The Institute began very humble. I remember trying to raise money to hire someone to answer the phone. And now I don't know how many people we have in the Institute. I'm just on the board. We hire a former Minister of Human Rights to be the leader of the Institute, the executive director. We have 3 lines of action. One has to do with education, another one has to do with journalism, and the third one has to do with history, with memory. We are the reference, as Paula also said, on the history about Brazil, the recent history about Brazil. We've collected thousands of data about that period, and then we put in our website, which made us an international reference of memory for Brazil. So we are part of a global network on memory, and we represent Brazil on that network. Like the Museum of Memory from Chile is another entity, and so on. We have much more about memory. For example, we are doing a research because the truth heroes during the dictatorship is not the people that were assassinated or disappeared. Are their partners, mostly their women's or girlfriends, that seek for justice and for truth, although we had an environment of violence, of terror. So that's why I give my compliments to women, because they are the true heroes, and they are the ones that are really change at least the reality in Brazil. They were the ones ahead of the amnesty movement and many others. And we are putting a book about that. We launched 2 days ago a book about the children that were kidnapped during the dictatorship in Brazil. People didn't know that happened in Brazil. They know about Argentina, they didn't know about Brazil, so we put that book out. So this is some of it. I have to really move fast. That clock is making me crazy, but let's focus here. So this is what we do about memory. On journalism, the Vladimir Herzog Journalism Award is going on for over 40 years, 40 years, even before our institute. And we've created an award for students of journalists to work with their teachers to present articles, journalist articles on human rights, as the professional award for journalists is also about human rights. And all that material goes to an online database, so you can research about articles that were published 30 years ago, and then you see that very little has changed in several areas. And finally, the one that gives me more proud, the leg of education, and I think that's the biggest message I want to leave here. We produce a lot of material sent to schools, and we saw the educational potential that it had. So we put together what I call a unit of action. I came from the private sector, so we like units. We have a unit of action with a senior leader, and we do education in human rights. I want to provoke you guys a little bit, but what's the goal of education? What's the question zero on education? I've been talking with lots of people in the government and lots of educators. Why do we educate people? To teach them how to read, write, maths, a little bit of science. I believe that the goal of education is to enable someone to be a citizen in a democratic society, to be a political entity in a political society. What that means? That means that we have to help our children, our people, that when they are an actor in a democratic society, they understand that society. They understand where we came from. They understand the issues that we've been dealing for decades or not even century of years. So our program of education tries to work a little bit on that, because education is big, and we have a program going in the city of São Paulo that reaches about 1 million children, 1,560 schools, called Respect is Needed. It's education in human rights, where we teach the value of diversity, that instead of getting away from something that is different from you, not trying to hear someone that thinks different from you, you should hear, you should be closer, because the difference is that what enriches you as a human being on a democratic society. You're only going to improve your thinking about different matters if you hear someone that thinks different from you. If he thinks the same, it's the same, nothing's going to change. So, I mean, this is one formal educational program that we have. We have another one, I don't have more time, the clock is 000, which is not formal education, where we make a dispute of values with conservative groups, and we chose to begin with evangelical churches. In Brazil, they are huge. So that program is going on in São Paulo, Rio, and Recife, and expanded to Bahia and Rio Grande do Sul. So we find inside those conservative groups, progressive subgroups, and we only intermediate and help them to get voice inside their own groups so they can make a dispute on values with those conservative groups, and therefore we try to make a more democratic and human society. Thank you.